Hello, my name is Jenny Thorvaldson. I am the Chief Economist and Director of Data Development here at IMPLAN. And today I'd like to talk to you about some of IMPLAN's primary data sources and methodologies and some additional notes of interest. So I will go ahead and share my screen and then start the presentation. And I want to start by noting that I'm talking about our annual IMPLAN data. This is kind of the bread and butter of IMPLAN that we release every year, and the data are used for economic impact analysis. We do have some additional data products that I will mention toward the end. I would also like to start by mentioning that the vast majority, almost every data source that we use is publicly available. And so a natural question might be, well, if anyone has access to those raw data, what value is IMPLAN adding? Well, quite a bit actually. So I'll talk about that in this first section. So the first thing we do, and potentially the most important, is creating or generating estimates of non-disclosed values. The government is not allowed to publish values that would allow anyone to identify a specific business. Therefore, the government hides some values when they publish a table of data, and they call those records non-disclosed records. Usually, though, they'll at least alert you to the presence of a non-disclosure and will at least reveal the existence or not of an industry. So, for example, they could very well tell you that 3 establishments in a certain metal mining industry exist in a certain region, but they won't tell you how many people work at those 3 establishments and how much money those employees earn working at those 3 establishments. So they might just give you an establishment count and the industry code, but not tell you anything else. And so we here at IMPLAN use a variety of techniques and other data sources to estimate the non-disclosed values. And we have various tiers of methods that we use to estimate non-disclosed values, be it looking at past years' raw data, turning to using ratios from a higher geographic level, or using a different data source. And all of that, we have all those details on our support website, which I'm going to talk about more later. Okay, so in addition to estimating missing values, we also disaggregate a lot of our data sources into finer geographic scales, because the smaller the geographic entity, the fewer raw data sources are available. So for example, we have far fewer raw data sources for zip code level data than we do for county level data. In counties, there are somewhat fewer data available than states. And of course, we have pretty much everything we need at a national level. So we have procedures to distribute some national values among the states, and then state values among the counties, and county values among the zip codes, using other data as distributors. So for example, there is no data source for industry output at the zip code level, but we can use zip code level data on industry employment and labor income to help distribute county level values of output to the zip codes that belong to that county. Similarly, we disaggregate a lot of data sources into finer industry detail. Almost all of our raw data sources have less sector detail than IMPLAN. One main exception of that is the Bureau of Labor Statistics Census of Employment and Wages data, which I'm going to get into later when we talk about sources. That is very highly detailed in terms of industries, but most of them are more aggregate in industries. And so we have procedures to distribute the more aggregate data down to the more detailed IMPLAN industries. And again, based on other data that do have the necessary sector detail, for instance, using the CEW data. IMPLAN's sectoring scheme is closely tied to the sectoring scheme in the Bureau of Economic Analysis benchmark IO tables, input-output tables. And I'm going to talk about that data source later. But our industry, we need to have production functions for each industry for which we provide in our models. And so that's why we're tightly tied to the industries that the BEA provides us. Okay, but we have worked to keep the industries that BEA has dropped, because sometimes they drop some industries over time and we keep them. So an example of this would be bowling as an industry. And then we also add some industries which the BEA has never given us data for. And the example for that is the detailed electricity production by generation type sectors that we have. So solar electricity, wind power electricity, fossil fuels, nuclear, all of those, geothermal, and hydropower, all of that. The BEA hasn't given us those data, so we consulted with an outside consultant to get us the necessary data for those sectors. Well, anyway, so as an example of this, so one of our data sources is the Bureau of Economic Analysis's regional economic accounts data, from which we get proprietor employment and income, among some other things. And they only have about 100 sectors, whereas IMPLAN has 546 sectors currently. And so we have to distribute and disaggregate those 100 sectors into the 546 sectors. And one of the main ways we do this is using that BLS CEW data, which I'll describe more later. Some of our data sources are lagged 1 year or more sometimes relative to the IMPLAN data year. So for example, at the time when we are creating the 2020 IMPLAN data, some of our data sources will have only released their 2019 data. And so we need to project those, and we use those, we do that using growth ratios from other data sources and things like that where necessary. Another thing we do is to adjust for undercoverage. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics CEW data, Census of Employment and Wages, which I'll talk about more later, but I've mentioned a couple times already, they don't fully cover several industries. And there's some that they don't cover at all. And we'll talk about those later. But we have to adjust for that and somehow boost those up, their estimates up, to account for undercovering those sectors. So we'll talk about that later. And then another example would be state colleges may report the employment from all of their branches as being in the county of the main branch. For example, Colorado State University is in Larimer County, Colorado, but it has branches. For example, it has a branch in Pueblo, Colorado, which is in El Paso County. And so we use other data sources. For example, in this case, we use IPEDS data, which is the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, where we use that data source instead of the CEW data, because we want to be sure that we're putting the university's employment into the right counties and make sure we don't lump it all into just the county where the main campus is. And then we also provide estimates for things for which there are no raw data at all. So the main example of this would be our estimates of domestic trade of goods and services. There really is no comprehensive data source for this out there anywhere. And this is trade between counties, so county-county trade flows. And there are some sources that provide a little bit of data, but that's only on shippable goods, not on services. And they often, there's some difficulty with them because they usually are based on origin of movement versus origin of production. Or origin of movement could be a warehouse rather than the place of production. And for doing impact analysis, we really need to know where that item was produced. And so that's why we use a gravity model instead of any raw data for our domestic trade flow estimates. And we have a whole video and lots of articles on our gravity model. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about those main data sources. Okay, let's start with what we get from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. We use several of their data sources, data sets, and probably the most important one are those benchmark input-output tables that I mentioned previously. They're released approximately every 5 years, and they give us several things, among which includes industry production functions, which basically just means what in each industry buys in order to produce what it produces. So lists of inputs with dollar values. Okay, and those inputs include raw materials as well as services, so accounting services and real estate and all kinds of stuff. We also get government spending, investment, and sales. We get margins, and those are for commodities that are sold at retail and wholesale outlets. And basically what they do is they show the proportions of that purchase price that we as consumers pay at the retailer, that the retailer gets to keep, the wholesaler gets to keep, the transporters that brought that good from the factory to the wholesaler or retailer, but they get to keep, and then the portion that the producing sector itself gets to keep. So margins are really important. And then we also get foreign trade of services that we use from that. Because the Census Bureau's annual data on foreign trade that we use is only foreign trade of shippable commodities, so goods, hard goods, and not services. So we turn to this benchmark data to give us those services, trade of services. We also, from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, we use those regional economic accounts data that I mentioned previously. They have industry level data, which includes, from that we get ratios of employee compensation to wage and salary income. This is important because we apply these ratios to the CEW data on wage and salary income so that we can get current values of employee compensation. Employee compensation is the full cost of the employee, and it includes benefits and social insurance taxes and things like that. So that's very important. It's also our main source, or only source, of proprietor employment and income, other value added, which would be other property income, which is pretty much corporate profits, and taxes on production and imports. We get output for most service sectors from the BEA-REA data, and we get output deflators for past years. In addition to industry-specific data, we have geography-level data, specifically net commuting rates, which we use those as control. They serve as control values for the county-to-county commuting flows that we get from the journey to work data. So lots going on here. Now, these data are lagged 1 year, and they have a low level of industry detail. So as I mentioned before, it only has about 100 sectors, so we have to disaggregate that. And because it's lagged 1 year, that's why we don't just grab the employee compensation data from BEA-REA and just use that. We use ratios from these data of employee compensation per wage and salary income and apply them to the CEW's values for wage and salary income, because the CEW data are not lagged. So we're just boosting those, converting those non-lagged CEW values for wage and salary income and converting them to employee compensation by using these ratios from the REA data. So we're using lagged ratios applied to a current value, giving us a current employee compensation value. And by doing that, we also disaggregate this into more industry detail because the CEW data have more industry detail. Okay, also from BEA, we have the NIPA tables. This is National Income and Product Accounts tables. They are released annually. They are not lagged. They are amazing, but they are national totals and they don't have industry or geographic detail. So they serve as the ultimate controls for almost everything in IMPLAN. So we get values for total foreign exports of goods, total foreign imports of goods, total foreign exports of services, and foreign imports of services. We get total GDP and each of its components. We get total employment by type, meaning wage and salary employment, proprietor employment, and a lot more. Output is one of the only things for which we do not have a NIPA control. All right, moving on to another bureau. We have Bureau of Labor Statistics. You've heard me talk about the CEW data a few times already today. We love the CEW data because they are current and they are very granular. If any of you know about the NAICS system, that's North American Industry Classification System, and it has various levels, but 6-digit level NAICS is the most detailed, and the CEW data do go down to the 6-digit level of detail. So that's wonderful. And it gives us wage and salary employment and income by industry. And I don't have a bullet point here for it, but I should mention that they provide data at the national level, the state level, and the county level. So it's just wonderful. As I did mention earlier, there are some undercovered and non-covered industries that we do have to account for and make adjustments for. And we use other data sources for those. Okay, we also get from the BLS future year deflators. So I was talking about BEA gave us past years deflators, and BLS gives us future year deflators. They use those as part of their work in projecting employment into the future. We also use the BLS's Consumer Expenditure Survey. This helps us disaggregate our personal consumption expenditure data that we get every year, which is what households spend their money on in that year. Those data will only have it's all households lumped together, and the Consumer Expenditure Survey has expenditures broken out by household types. So it's household income groups, I should say. So the CES data are lagged, which is why we don't just straight up use them. We have to use the PCE data because it's current. But we use this lagged CES data to help break out the PCE data into 9 household income categories, since each household income category spends on different things at different rates. Okay, from the USDA, we use some NAS and ERS data. So National Agricultural Statistics Service and Economic Research Service, and from them we get state level output for farm industries. And also from the USDA, we use Census of Agriculture data when that comes out. And from the Census of Agriculture, we get county level output for farm industries, which is great. And then various ratios that we use to help round out all the farm sectors. So for example, employee compensation per output, employee compensation per employment, all kinds of things, because we have to fill out every element of data for every industry in every place. So it takes a lot to do that. Okay, now moving on to yet another bureau. We have the Census Bureau. We get output and inventory for our manufacturing industries, and that's from the annual survey of manufacturers. We get construction industry output. I don't have it on here, but we get wholesale and retail industry output as well. We get foreign exports and imports of shippable commodities, as I had mentioned previously. That is a data set that we actually purchase. So it is publicly available, but not for free. We get revenue and expenditures by state, county, and city governments. We get a lot of demographic data, which right now is just population and household counts, but we are working on expanding our demographic data, and most of that also comes from the Census Bureau. And then geographic data, like the list of counties every year, because those change periodically. MSA lists, zip code lists, that definitely changes every year. And then a mapping from zip codes to congressional districts, and also land areas for all of these geographies. And there are even more data sources, more than I've even listed here. It's a really long list of all the data sources we use, and if anyone's interested in hearing more about them, please do just reach out or do a search on our support site. But a few others I just wanted to point out are the Railroad Retirement Board. For them, we are looking for data for employment and income of railroad employees, and that's because railroad employees, they have their own unemployment insurance system, and they're not under the federal one, and therefore they're not included in that BLSCEW data. So we have to go somewhere else to find data, and thankfully the Railroad Retirement Board provides us with those data. From the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, their Fisheries Statistics Division, we get output for the commercial fishing sector. The reason we use them is because our BEA output data are lagged a year and have to be projected. So when we can find a different data source for any industry for which we would otherwise be using that BEA output data, we try to find that. We would like to use another source that provides us with current data if possible, so that we don't have to try to project data. And that's a similar story or reason behind us using the Energy Information Administration, which we use for getting output for the electricity generation sectors, oil and gas extraction industry, and the petroleum refining industry. Again, that's because the EIA data aren't lagged, whereas the BEA output data are lagged. And this is really critical for sectors like this. They're harder to project because these sectors, the price of their commodity, oil and gas, electricity, can change so much year to year. They're fairly volatile, making it harder to project them. So it's better to use a non-lagged data source. Okay, some just final notes is that quality control is performed at each step. So it's a very sequential process producing the IMPLAN data. We start in the summer, we end in the fall. Just as each raw data source comes out, we do our processing of that data source, we do quality control on that. Then we might, after disclosing values and doing quality control on that, we then have to convert to IMPLAN sectoring, and then we do more quality control. And then we add additional data sources, and each step of the way has quality control taken care of. We don't just wait until the end. I wanted to also point out that the IMPLAN data have full geographic balancing. So all of the zip codes that belong to a county, if you added up their values in the IMPLAN data, they would perfectly match the values of the county level data in IMPLAN. And if you added up all the counties in a state, all of their values, be it output, employment, household spending, whatever it is, if you add them up, they're going to equal IMPLAN's state level values for that state. And likewise, all of the states sum up to the national. And almost every value at the national level in IMPLAN, in the IMPLAN US model, are going to be, you'll be able to see those numbers on the internet if you look at those NIPA tables, and they all balance. So there's that. I do want to mention though that because our raw data sources occasionally change, some will go away, sometimes we'll discover new data sources, sometimes we'll learn something new about a data source and decide that we need to be treating it differently or what have you. Our methodologies and sources do change somewhat year to year, usually not in any drastic way, but over time, those little changes can really add up. So for this reason, every 5 years, we go back and re-estimate all the IMPLAN data going all the way back to 2001. And in addition to incorporating any improvements in sources and methods, it also incorporates revised raw values, because the government sometimes goes back and revises some of their raw data after we've already used their first estimates. So when we go back and re-estimate all of our data, we'll grab new raw data values. And then of course, when we're estimating years that are far back in time, we don't have any lagged raw values, because when I go back and rerun 2001 data, all the data for 2001 are out. They've been out for many years, so I don't have to use any 2000 data when estimating 2001 values. So that's something to keep in mind, and those, yeah, just that. And then, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this presentation was about our kind of regular annual data product, but we have other data products, including occupation and competency data by geography and by industry. We have environmental data and some other things. So, and they have their own sources, and you can find all the information about those sources and even more details about what I talked about today at our support site, support.implan.com. And I also just wanted to conclude by mentioning that our processes have been honed over more than 30 years. So we have a lot of pride in our data, but feel free to grill us about any of our sources or methods and ask us questions about it, because we do like to continue to improve if new sources come out or if we learn new information about them. We at IMPLAN are very proud of not being a black box. So reach out to us at any time, and please do visit our support website. And that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.